Usually once a wrestler settles on a name, then you're not going to find someone else using it. That's right, there is no second version of Stone Cold Steve Austin, and there's never going to be another Undertaker. But even then, there are a few occasions when this trend has been bucked, and two performers have gone by the exact same name for one reason or another. But what are the biggest examples of this in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the case of the dual Gorgeous Georges. Yes, back in the 1940s and 1950s, the most well-known gimmick in all of wrestling was that of Gorgeous George, a vain and pompous heel character created by George Wagner. So great would this one be, in fact, many to this day consider it the first truly great gimmick ever created for the wrestling industry. And that's why it's still held in such high regard all these years on. But George Wagner would not be the only person who held this moniker. No, decades after he hung up his boots, a whole new version would come along, though this one wouldn't have many similarities to the original. And on top of that, it would come from a surprising place. What would that surprising place be? Well, Macho Man Randy Savage, as this was the time he bought the rights to the name and used it for his valet in WCW. Yes, during the late 90s, when the Macho Man was finding a second wind to his career down in Atlanta, he decided it was time he brought in a new valet to replace past ones such as Miss Elizabeth and Sensational Sherry. This time, though, he wouldn't use either of those performers. Rather, he'd bring in a rookie by the name of Stephanie Bellers, and in order to make her seem more exciting to audiences, give her the name of a legend from the past. That's right, in one fell swoop, Gorgeous George was reborn, and this time, rather than be a pompous male heel, it would be a young woman, a strange decision on the face of things for sure. But then, to be fair, if anyone was ever going to bring the Gorgeous George gimmick back, then it made sense Randy Savage would be the one to do it, as so much of his character had been cribbed from what George Wagner was doing back during the post-war years. Hell, they even used the same theme song, the iconic Pomp and Circumstance. Needless to say, though, this new version of George was not so long-lasting and not as big of a difference maker. And that's exactly why, by the time 1999 was over, the gimmick would have been quietly shelved as Randy moved on to other things and WCW continued its death spiral. Just as well, this wouldn't be the only time a gimmick used in WCW was reused then. And in the case of our next entry, this would happen in Atlanta first, and then in another company later, as it would be the time that the Butcher appeared in both World Championship Wrestling and All Elite Wrestling. Yes, we all know who Brutus Beefcake is, and we all also know that he was a man who had about 1,000 different gimmicks over the course of his career. For the purposes of today's video, though, the gimmick we want to focus upon is that of the Butcher, the one he used upon turning heel on Hulk Hogan in 1994 WCW and joining up with the Three Faces of Fear. Sure, it might not have been the greatest gimmick he ever had, but it did see him reach arguably his highest highs, as it allowed him to main event Starrcade that year with the Hulkster. Of course, as time moved on, however, and Ed Leslie moved on to new things, he'd leave that Butcher moniker behind, with it being assumed at this point that it was a name which would never be used again. That was until it was, because it was in November of 2019 that a new tag team made their debut in the then burgeoning All Elite Wrestling, a team collectively known as the Butcher and the Blade. Why had Andy Williams, the man now using the Butcher moniker, decided to take this old Ed Leslie gimmick for himself? To be honest, it's possible he and everyone else involved had forgotten the name was ever used before because, as we said before, Beefer's time under that name didn't exactly represent the best work he ever did. Whatever the reason, the fact was, the Butcher had now been reborn, and this time, rather than being a cartoon gimmick used as a foil to Hulk Hogan, it was a slightly less cartoon gimmick used as part of the AEW mid-card tag team division. Yes, the reality is that this version of the Butcher never reached the same heights in managing to main event a major pay-per-view or anything. And to be honest, we don't see that fact changing anytime soon, as, while he is still currently employed by AEW, Andy Williams is pretty low down on the pecking order there. Maybe what he needs then is some advice from our next subjects, as they both seem to have found greater success despite sharing the same name. Who are we talking about here? Why, Butch and Butch, of course. That's right, Butch, now once more known as Pete Dunne, and the 80s tag team star Bushwhacker Butch of the Bushwhackers. Sure, these two performers might seem like polar opposites at first, as Pete Dunne is something of a technical wrestling maestro, and back in the golden era WWF, the Bushwhackers were effectively a comedy duo. But it was not always this way for them. No, before they ever went to the WWF, Butch and his partner Luke would be known as the Sheepherders, and it was well under that name they became known as one of the most savage and brutal teams in the entire industry. Of course, after joining WWF in 1988, this all changed as they'd become a lot more family-friendly. And this wasn't the only time such a thing happened with a performer named Butch either, because, as we mentioned a moment ago, Pete Dunne would later meet a similar fate. That's right, after spending years on both the UK indie circuit and NXT UK building up a name for himself as a technical assassin, it was in March of 2022 that he'd be called up to SmackDown, and now being booked by Vince McMahon would be turned into a parody of himself, one now going by the name of Butch. What was the gimmick the Englishman was being given to work with here exactly? Well, he appeared to be something of a Victorian chimney sweep. Luckily though, since McMahon left the company later that year, Pete Dunne has returned to his old name, and while this hasn't seen him reach the main event scene or anything, it has allowed him to find a far more stable spot on the card as a more serious performer, with this playing to his strengths rather than his weaknesses. Will we ever see a third Butch in WWE at this point? We suppose it's possible, but to be honest, we wouldn't count on it. No, given the relative obscurity it still holds, we say it's far likelier we see a third version of our next gimmick before all is said and done, that being the one held by both Nightmare Danny Davis and Dangerous Danny Davis. And when we're talking about Nightmare Danny Davis specifically, the one portrayed by journeyman performer Daniel Briley, he was able to find some measure of success on the territory circuit back during the 80s and even the 90s. Hell, at one point he'd even briefly show up in WCW, albeit under a mask and as part of a tag team known as the Galaxians. And after that, he'd give arguably his biggest contribution to the business when he formed Ohio Valley Wrestling in 1997. The same Ohio Valley Wrestling which not only later became a developmental territory to WWE for a while, but which was also later sold to Al Snow and featured in the Netflix documentary series The Wrestlers. As for the other Danny Davis, Dangerous Danny Davis, well, rather than finding his moment in the big time down in WCW, he'd have his brief time in the spotlight in WWF instead. And that would come during the late 80s, as this was when, after spending years working for the Fed as a referee, he'd finally be able to lace up his boots himself and spend a couple of years mixing it up with the likes of Rowdy Roddy Piper and Tito Santana. No, he'd never go all the way to the top of the mountain by winning any gold, but this was still a nice run for Danny, and one he can hang his hat on even to this day. And it also gives him the honor of being the first example in wrestling history of an official turning crooked and then hitting the ring himself. Well, let's move away from the 80s now and on to something a lot closer to the modern day, as it's been in TNA over the last couple of decades that we've seen the Moose gimmick show up not just once, but twice. Yes, while there is a Moose in TNA today, one of the stalwarts of the promotion played by Quinn Ojanaka, this was not the first time someone working for that particular company went by that particular name. No, years prior, back in 2008, a certain indie performer by the name of Mickey Lee Knuckles, someone best known for her deathmatch antics in places like IWA Mid-South, appeared in the Impact Zone bearing the same moniker. What was the story behind this one? Well, that was just the name Mickey was given by Dixie Carter when she signed on the dotted line. So it was then that for a few months after that, Moose aligned herself with the Beautiful People during their ongoing feud against the babyface women's roster of TNA. And this led to her having a brawl or two against performers such as Roxy, Gail Kim, and ODB. Sadly though, after breaking her leg, she'd end up leaving the promotion. But this wouldn't be the end of Moose in TNA, because as we all know, a few years later in 2016, that name would come around again when former football player and Ring of Honor performer Quinn Ojanaka signed on the dotted line and lent his services to the company. And this would prove to be a much better run that the new version of Moose went on, as rather than have a short-lived time in Nashville which ultimately went nowhere, Moose 2.0 would go all the way to the top by becoming a 3-time world champion in the promotion. That's right, as it stands today, Moose remains one of the biggest stars TNA has. But he hasn't been the only reason to watch TNA in recent years, because not long ago, their women's division got a major boost with the inclusion of a name who would have been familiar to older Impact fans, the name of Trinity. Yes, let's start at the earliest point here, as years before Trinity Fatu ever showed up in the Impact Zone, it was in 2002, during the original days of TNA, that Stephanie Finocchio made her debut there. And as we're sure you can all guess by now, the name Finocchio went by at this time was Trinity. How would Trinity fare in this new home? Well, while she never won any gold or anything, she wasn't exactly a pushover either. No, during her time down in Tennessee, she not only mixed it up with women like Tracy Brooks and ODB, but also men like Kid Cash, Amazing Red, and others. That's right, in becoming one of the first women in TNA history to ever challenge for a men's title when she took on Cash for the X Division Championship, Trinity was able to etch her name in the history books in a small way. And this accolade would be enough to see her continue on with the promotion all the way up until 2005, at which point she joined WWE for a couple of years under the new gimmick of manager to the full-blooded Italians. But as we know, that wouldn't be the last time a woman named Trinity graced the halls of Impact. No, well, she was better known as Naomi then, two-time former SmackDown Women's Champion. Once Trinity walked out of WWE alongside Sasha Banks in 2022, she'd be forced to come up with a different name. And what better name to use in this situation than your own? And so it was then that the former Naomi would debut under her real name of Trinity in April of 2023. And what a coup this was for TNA, because Fatu was able to give their women's division some legitimate star power. Needless to say then, it wouldn't be long before she was winning championship gold there in the form of the TNA Knockouts World title. And after that run was over and Trinity had helped boost the brand of Impact, she'd return home to WWE in 2024, the very place she continues to work to this day as one half of their women's tag team champions alongside Bianca Belair. And it's back in WWE we find our next example of two female performers who shared a name as it happened. Yes, it's time for us to talk about the dual versions of Carmela in WWE. Don't remember the first Carmela? The one who appeared briefly in WWE during 2004 as part of that year's Divas search? We wouldn't blame you if you didn't, because there wasn't really much to write home about when it came to this run, sadly. No, after becoming a contestant in the competition and ultimately failing to win, Carmela de Caesar would briefly work for the company anyway when she entered into a feud with Christy Hemme. That said, as this was mid-2000s WWE Women's Wrestling, there weren't exactly a lot of mat classics involved in the program which followed. And that was probably why, before the year was out, the rookie would decide wrestling wasn't for her and that she'd be better served returning to a career in modeling. But this wouldn't be the last Carmela in WWE, as it was years later in 2013 that we got another. Yes, it was during this year that Leah Vandal, daughter of journeyman performer Paul Vandal, signed on the dotted line with WWE and was from there shipped down to NXT, where she was immediately repackaged as Carmela, manager to Enzo and Big Cass. Of course, as time went on though, she escaped the shackles of being a mere manager. In fact, by the time Carmela made it up to the main roster in 2016, she'd be a full-blown solo act. And this allowed her to reach heights she never would have dreamed were possible only a few years before. What were some of these heights? Well, aside from becoming the inaugural Miss Money in the Bank in 2017, and technically the second Miss Money in the Bank as well, Vandal would become SmackDown Women's Champion after beating Charlotte Flair for the honor later the following year. And after that run was over and she was firmly established as a player, she'd continue to find success both as a singles and a tag team act, particularly during her run as WWE Women's Tag Team Champion alongside Zelina Vega. So clearly then, this is a case of one person having a particular name finding far more success than the other. And that's not the only time such a thing has happened either, because if we move over to our next subjects, then we'll find a similar story playing itself out. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but the father-son duo of Ted DiBiase Jr. and Ted DiBiase Sr. Now, any wrestling fan will be all too aware of who Ted DiBiase Sr. is, and that's because during the first boom period of the industry, he was able to go on a hell of a run as one of the top heels of WWF, with this $1 Million Man gimmick serving as a regular foil to babyface acts like Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, and even the Ultimate Warrior. Hell, so over was he as a villain, he'd even get his own custom world title in the form of the $1 Million Championship. And once his run in WWF came to an end, he'd get to have another great run in WCW, where he served as the benefactor to the New World Order. Even if you go back to his pre-WWF days, in fact, you'll find a young Debiasi absolutely tearing it up in territories like Mid-South Wrestling, the very place he became an NWA North American Heavyweight Champion on 5 separate occasions. All of this is to say that he's a legend of the industry and will be considered as such for the rest of time. So it's no surprise that his son, Ted Debiasi Jr., must have felt an incredible weight coming down on his shoulders when he made his debut as a performer for the WWE main roster in 2008. Would Ted Jr. be able to rise to the occasion and become as big of a star as his dad was? Not quite, sadly. And the reason for that was because, while he might have shared the same name as his old man, he just didn't have the same level of aptitude for the ring. Not that Ted Jr. did nothing during his run, though. No, even if he never went all the way to the top, he still did find some measure of success, as it was alongside his tag team partner Cody Rhodes that he became 2-time World Tag Team Champion during the late 2000s. And once that run was over, well, while his singles run wouldn't go quite as well, it did last for long enough to see him continue on in WWE for a couple of years, all before he eventually left the industry behind altogether during the 2010s. Sadly though, even if things didn't always go well, he'll still be able to look back on that run he had as a wrestler and remember that, at least for a little while, he was able to follow in his more famous dad's footsteps by carrying on the legacy of the Debiasi family in the ring. And this wouldn't be the only time a family legacy of wrestling was carried over from father to son. No, as we're sure you're all aware, there have been countless examples over the years, but while Dusty and Cody Rhodes or Rocky and Dwayne Johnson might have found success under different names, Chavo Guerrero Sr. and his son Chavo Guerrero Jr. were able to do so by using the same one. And to tell the story of Chavo Guerrero Sr., we need to flash back to the 80s, as that was when he first rose to prominence in the territory circuit. Where would he wrestle at this point? Pretty much anywhere worth wrestling, and that's what led to him popping up in places like All Japan, Memphis, Mid-South, and the AWA throughout that decade, and wowing fans with his in-ring skills every time. One place Chavo Sr. never made it to, though, was WWE. No, that wouldn't happen for him or any of his offspring until 2001, as it was then that, following the collapse of WCW, his son Chavo Jr. found himself with an all-new employer in Vince McMahon. And this led to the Cruiserweight getting a chance to shine with a whole new audience than he had down in Atlanta prior, as he went on to win the Cruiserweight title on multiple further occasions, all while having great matches against performers such as Rey Mysterio, Edge, and Kurt Angle. As time went on, however, it was felt that Chavo Jr. needed something to spruce up his character, and this was why his father was brought on board then as Chavo Classic. And Chavo Classic wouldn't just work alongside his son here. No, he'd arguably outshine him, as at one point he'd actually steal his Cruiserweight title away for his own. And what's more, he did this while he was well into his 50s. Of course, as time went on, though, this run would come to an end and it would be back to Chavo Guerrero Jr. going solo, carrying on his family's legacy without the help of his father, with it being this path which saw him become something of a journeyman in his later years by working for places as wide and varied as TNA, Lucha Underground, and AEW. One person he never got a chance to work with again, though, was an old WCW colleague of his named Ernest Miller, someone better known by the name he shared with a former WWF Attitude Era Women's star, The Cat. Yes, the spellings were slightly different with these two, but The Cat with a C and The Cat with a K are similar enough, and as we mentioned a moment ago, when we're talking about The Cat with a C, we're talking about Ernest Miller, one of the mid-card stars of WCW during the Monday Night Wars. Why did he take on this nickname back then? Well, that was because, like a cat, he had some smooth moves, and this led to him taking on something of a dancing gimmick as he managed to become one of the most popular comedic acts the company had. That's right, while there was certainly a limit on what the Cat was going to be able to achieve in WCW with a comedy gimmick, that limit didn't stop him from having entertaining feuds against the likes of Lance Storm and Chris Kanyon. And it also didn't stop him from going over to WWE 2 in 2002, and there spending a couple of years on the Velocity brand. Of course, this wasn't the first time there had been a cat on WWE TV, however, as a few years prior to that, during the Attitude Era, Stacey Carter, then shoot girlfriend of Jerry the King Lawler, had made the gimmick her own. What did she do while going by the name of The Cat with a K? Well, initially, she'd be something of an exhibitionist, someone who, in true Attitude Era fashion, had one goal, and that goal was to get scantily clad on the show. And it wasn't like this was the only thing the cat did in WWF, because after that, she'd serve a spell as the manager of sorts to Chyna, and even go on to win the women's title herself at one point. And it was also the early days of the Attitude Era, which gave us the first half of our next entry as it happened, because that was when Los Boricuas formed, complete with member Jesus, the first of two men in WWE who would ultimately go by that name. Sure, it might seem strange that two men have gone by the name Jesus in WWE, but when you consider that in Spanish-speaking countries this is a common name, perhaps it's not that odd at all. After all, outside of places like America, the UK, and India, Mexico has one of the biggest audiences for the WWE. And that's why back in 1997, as part of the Gang Wars storyline which was going on in the wake of WWF trying to catch up to the NWO, Los Boricuas were formed, with them being a foursome of Hispanic stars made up of Savio Vega, Miguel Perez, Jose Estrada, and the aforementioned Jesus Castillo. How would Jesus fare during his run in WWF? Not particularly well, if we're being honest. No, as one of the lowest on the ladder members of that stable, his job would usually be to eat the pinfall at the end of the match. And when Los Boricuas' time came to an end in early 1998, he'd find himself being relegated to doing jobs on C shows like Shotgun Saturday Night, a step down from the low rung he was already on before that. Thankfully though, once Jesus Castillo left WWF in 1999 and ventured over to Puerto Rico instead, it wouldn't be the last time we saw someone with that name appear on WWE TV. As about the time Carlito got into a feud with John Cena over the United States Championship back in 2004, and in the process brought in backup to help him, backup in the form of Aaron Aguilera. Yes, after being rechristened as simply Jesus, Aaron Aguilera would set to work on taking out Big Match John before his bout with Carlito could happen. And that led to him attacking him in the middle of a club. As to what Jesus did after this, well, he wouldn't do much, to be honest. No, with his purpose now served, he'd disappear from TV after a blow-off street fight with Cena at Armageddon later that year. Still, even if his run was short-lived, Aaron Aguilera's time under the Jesus gimmick means he's remembered to this day by WWE fans, even if it's only as a footnote. But when you have a nice piece of trivia attached to your legacy, this can sometimes happen. And the trivia of sharing a name with another wrestler is something all of the people we've looked at today most certainly have in common.